Hello, this is Rachel Durkin Durga, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the 21st of January issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Mark Carney's Davos speech is a, quote, manifesto of free people, end quote. Here's what else the world is saying, by Alan Woods. Before the American buzzkill, the Canadian buzz. Wednesday, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, was spent in anticipation of the planned speech of U.S. President Donald Trump, and in awe of the one delivered Tuesday by Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney's keynote address to the gathering of business and political leaders didn't explicitly mention Trump or America, but he called for middle power countries like Canada to stop cowering in the shadows of, quote, great powers, end quote, and forge new partnerships based on shared democratic values. It was heard widely as a cri de coeur at a turbulent time in global politics, with Trump threatening to annex Greenland, upending trade relations, and drafting plans for a, quote, board of peace, end quote, that would seem to rival the mandate of the United Nations, all while extending membership invitations to the likes of Vladimir Putin of Russia. Quote, I think it was an excellent speech, end quote, Finnish President Alexander Stubb said of Carney's speech at the end of a panel Wednesday on Europe's security challenges. Quote, it was a deep analysis of the change in the world order and the new balance that we're looking at. It was very realistic. All in all, I think one of the best speeches that we've heard here in Davos this week so far, end quote. Marko Mihkelson, the chair of the Estonian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, went a few steps further in his praise, calling Carney's speech, quote, a genuine manifesto of free people standing up to bullies. Listen, adjust, and execute, end quote, he wrote on social media. Carney's address was covered widely in the international press, with the former editor of the London-based Financial Times, Lionel Barber, calling it, quote, the speech of a statesman, end quote, end quote. Lulu Garcia Navarro, co-host of The Interview, a New York Times podcast, wrote on social media that it was, quote, unimaginable, end quote, just a year ago, when Trump returned to the White House, that a Canadian leader would be taking such a tone in response to his American counterpart. Quote, when historians look back at this era, this speech by Mark Carney will be seen as an inflection point, end quote. Canadian International Trade Minister Manindir Sidhu said the government has received messages of support for Carney's speech, quote, from around the world from counterparts, including Canadians from across the political spectrum, end quote. He said that Canada's ties to America would always be important, but that Carney is backing up his words with actions and eyeing new trade relationships, with India next on his list. Quote, we need to take off our rose-colored glasses and look at the world as it is, and that's exactly how Canadians want us to approach this relationship that we're building with countries from around the world, end quote. Others, however, have taken a more skeptical view of the Davos address, including one Canadian who knows all too well the implications of great power nations who decide to act out their displeasure. Michael Kovrig, a former Canadian diplomat now working as an Asia analyst with the International Crisis Group, spent 1,019 days in Chinese detention, along with fellow Canadian citizen Michael Spavor, a measure seen as retaliation for the arrest in Vancouver of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. He initially reacted to Carney's address with praise, calling it, quote, the best speech by a world leader, end quote, that he had recently come across. But he criticized Carney's decision to compare the breakdown of what is known as the, quote, rules-based international order, end quote, the system of agreements, treaties, and laws that have served as the foundation of the United Nations and much of the developed world since the Second World War, to the propaganda and lies that sustained communism in Eastern Europe. Drawing on a notable essay by the Czech dissident and later President Václav Havel, Carney likened the necessity today of admitting the shortcomings and problems of one with courage of dissidents who spoke truth to totalitarian power in the late 1980s in the fight for political freedom. Kovrig said such a comparison was, quote, rhetorically dangerous. It blurs the difference between democratic hypocrisy and totalitarian coercion, and it invites the interpretation that liberal order itself has been a quasi-ideological fraud, which for all its many flaws, it has not been, end quote, he wrote. Canada's military has modeled hypothetical U.S. invasion, reports say, by Laura Dillon Kane. Canada's military has modeled how it would respond to an American invasion after President Donald Trump publicly talked about the country as a potential 51st state, according to a report in the Globe and Mail. The northern nation's defense would include tactics similar to those used in Afghanistan against Russia and later U.S.-led forces, according to the Globe, which cited government officials it didn't name. The officials stressed they consider a U.S. invasion to be highly unlikely. The Economist, also citing people it didn't name, reported earlier this month that Canada's military is also discussing worst-case scenarios that, though improbable, quote, now include incursions by America, end quote. The preparations underscore how sharply relations between the two long-standing allies have deteriorated during Trump's second term. The countries have not been in armed conflict against each other since the War of 1812, when Canada, then a British colony, successfully repelled American advances. Since then, the U.S. military has grown into the world's most powerful. Officials told the Globe the model assumes an attack from the south, in which American forces would overcome Canada's positions on land and at sea within a week, or potentially in as little as 2 days. In such a scenario, the Canadian military envisions small groups of irregular fighters or armed civilians carrying out ambushes, sabotage, or drone warfare, the Globe reported. Those tactics could include so-called, quote, hit and run, end quote, attacks, involving improvised explosive devices similar to those used by the Taliban in Afghanistan against the U.S. and allied forces, including Canada. The Office of Canada's Defense Minister did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The reports come as Trump takes an increasingly aggressive posture toward Greenland, Canada's Arctic neighbor. In an early morning Truth Social post on Tuesday, he published an image showing a map with both Canada and Greenland covered by the American flag. Wesley Wark, a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, said a direct U.S. military invasion of Canada was, quote, extremely unlikely, end quote, though he'd heard from contacts in the defense sector that contingency planning was underway as a worst-case scenario. These plans were prompted by Trump's second administration and were not in place during the Biden presidency, he said. They are tightly held, and he has not reviewed them directly, Wark added. Quote, the planning is necessary. The prospect is unimaginable, end quote, he said. Quote, I think the real concerns for the Canadian government are less the unreality of a U.S. military attack on Canada and more the growing realities of economic coercion and political pressure, end quote. Potential U.S. political pressure points include exploiting and amplifying separatist movements in Alberta and Quebec through tactics such as disinformation campaigns, he said, while economic coercion could manifest as demands for open access to Canadian energy resources, critical minerals, and water. Security pressures could arise over the Canadian Arctic, with the U.S. potentially demanding greater access and control, and possibly reigniting the dispute over the sovereignty of the Northwest Passage, Wark said. In the unlikely event of a full-scale assault, a Canadian defense strategy would probably involve partisan warfare and a retreat to, quote, northern fortresses, end quote, to preserve military and governmental capabilities. Canada is a vast country, he pointed out, quote, the occupation of which would be hugely challenging for the American military, end quote. Foreign Minister Anita Anand told Bloomberg in an interview on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, that Canada is bolstering its Arctic presence. The country plans to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense this fiscal year and aims to meet the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's 5% target by 2035. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney is considering sending a small contingent of troops to Greenland to join forces from Denmark, France, the UK, and other nations for NATO exercises, but has not announced a final decision. Quote, Canada will never be the 51st state, end quote, Anand said. Quote, we will always ensure that we stand foursquare behind our NATO allies, end quote. Premier Eby says new markets reforms will help forestry, but results will take time, by Wolfgang Deppner. Premier David Eby says a recent agreement advancing wood construction in China will deliver results for the forestry industry in British Columbia, but also acknowledges that it will take, quote, time, energy, and commitment, end quote, to create a sustainable industry. A 5-year agreement between British Columbia's Forest Ministry and the Chinese government signed last week boosts the research, development, and promotion of modern wood construction in China, and Eby says it is part of the work that will deliver results for the provincial forestry industry by diversifying markets. Eby delivered the keynote address at the BC Natural Resources Forum in Prince George, BC, Tuesday night, and says British Columbia's forestry industry has taken the biggest hit from U.S. tariffs. A draft of the speech released before the event says punitive tariffs from the U.S. have had devastating effects on the foundational industry of forestry, including mill closures leading to job losses and communities losing revenue. The Premier says his government has been fighting on multiple fronts, including tackling what he calls, quote, long-standing structural permitting issues, end quote. He says there are no quick fixes when it comes to permitting, but adds that, quote, reform is overdue, end quote, in praising a recent landscape plan for the Nimkish Valley on Vancouver Island as a milestone. Eby says the plan has delivered higher harvest levels, predictability for industry, and ecological protection, bringing together governments, First Nations, and industry to manage an area of 1,660 square kilometers near Albert Bay and Port McNeill. These results will take time, he says, but, quote, they are real, quote, and they are the future of a sustainable industry, end quote. He says his recent trade trip to India has also shown him the significance of that country as a market opportunity, which can be realized through minor changes in outreach to furniture makers and high-end home builders. Eby says the work around forestry is, quote, challenging, end quote, and, quote, it feels always too slow for the urgency of the threat, end quote, but promises that, quote, predictable land access, permit reform, value-added investments, and new trading relationships, end quote, will deliver a better future for forestry. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Legal battles over immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota intensify, by Steve Karnowski and Alana Durkin-Richer. As confrontations with federal officers over their massive immigration enforcement operation in Minnesota showed no signs of stopping Wednesday, legal battles over the surge and the local response were also intensifying. Federal prosecutors served grand jury subpoenas Tuesday to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's office and 5 other officials in the state as part of an investigation into whether they obstructed or impeded law enforcement during a sweeping immigration operation in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, a person familiar with the matter said. The subpoenas, which seek records, were also sent to the offices of Attorney General Keith Ellison, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, St. Paul Mayor Kahole, her and officials in Ramsey and Hennepin counties, the person said. The person was not authorized to publicly discuss an ongoing investigation and spoke to the Associated Press on condition of anonymity. The subpoenas came a day after the government urged a judge to reject efforts to stop the immigration enforcement surge that has roiled Minneapolis and St. Paul for weeks. The Justice Department called the state's lawsuit, filed soon after the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an immigration officer, quote, legally frivolous, end quote. Ellison has said the government is violating free speech and other constitutional rights. Vice President J.D. Vance, meanwhile, is expected to travel to Minneapolis on Thursday for a roundtable with local leaders and community members, according to sources familiar with his plans, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the trip had not yet been officially announced. The subpoenas are related to an investigation into whether Minnesota officials obstructed federal immigration enforcement through public statements they made, two people familiar with the matter said Friday. They said then that it was focused on the potential violation of a conspiracy statute. In a subpoena released by Frey's office, the long list of documents required include, quote, any records tending to show a refusal to come to the aid of immigration officials, end quote. Frey said, quote, we shouldn't have to live in a country where people fear that federal law enforcement will be used to play politics or crack down on local voices they disagree with, end quote. The governor's office referred reporters to a statement earlier Tuesday in which Waltz said the Trump administration was not seeking justice, only creating distractions. Greg Bovino of U.S. Border Patrol, who has commanded the Trump administration's big city immigration crackdown, said more than 10,000 people in the U.S. illegally have been arrested in Minnesota in the past year, including 3,000, quote, of some of the most dangerous offenders, end quote, in the last 6 weeks during Operation Metro Surge. Julia Decker, policy director at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, expressed frustrations that advocates have no way of knowing whether the government's arrest numbers and descriptions of the people in custody are accurate. Good, 37, was killed on January 7th as she was moving her vehicle, which had been blocking a Minneapolis street where ICE officers were operating. Trump administration officials say the officer, Jonathan Ross, shot her in self-defense, although videos of the encounter show the Honda pilot slowly turning away from him. Since then, the public has repeatedly confronted officers, blowing whistles and yelling insults at ICE and Border Patrol. They, in turn, have used tear gas and chemical irritants against protesters. Bystanders have recorded video of officers using a battering ram to get into a house, as well as smashing vehicle windows and dragging people out of cars. Bovino defended his, quote, troops, end quote, and said their actions are, quote, legal, ethical, and moral, end quote. A Minnesota church targeted by an anti-ICE protest Sunday decried it as unlawful, while one of the protest leaders called for the resignation of a church leader who works at a local ICE office. About 36 people entered City's church in St. Paul, some walking right up to the pulpit. Quote, invading a church service to disrupt the worship of Jesus or any other act of worship is protected by neither the Christian scriptures nor the laws of this nation, end quote, City's church in St. Paul said Tuesday in a statement shared by its pastor, Jonathan Parnell. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem described the protesters as, quote, agitators, end quote, in a post on X, and said, quote, arrests coming, end quote. Nekima Levy Armstrong, a lawyer and local activist, called for another pastor who works at ICE to resign from the church, saying his dual role poses, quote, a fundamental moral conflict, end quote. Trump says, quote, Canada lives because of the United States, end quote, during speech in Davos, says he won't use military force in Greenland, by Alan Woods. U.S. President Donald Trump has fired back at Prime Minister Mark Carney and his Davos speech. The American leader said that despite the strong words condemning the New World Order, Canada is totally dependent on America. Quote, Canada lives because of the United States, end quote, Trump said in a speech to the World Economic Forum. He was speaking about the need for the U.S. to acquire Greenland, an autonomous territory that belongs to the Kingdom of Denmark. Trump said it is needed to build the Golden Dome missile defense system. Quote, we're going to build the greatest Golden Dome ever built, Trump said. It's going to just by its very nature be defending Canada, end quote. He then criticized Canada for not being, quote, grateful, end quote, for America's protection. Quote, Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, end quote, he said. Quote, I watched your prime minister yesterday. He wasn't so grateful, but they should be grateful to us, Canada. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements, end quote. Trump's threats to acquire Greenland have soured relations between Europe and the U.S. in recent days, particularly after he threatened tariffs against countries who try to oppose the proposed acquisition. Denmark last week announced a military exercise to beef up military patrols on the Arctic island and assert sovereignty. Trump laid out his case again for taking control of Greenland and said, quote, I don't have to use force, I don't want to use force, and I won't use force, end quote. But he said it was a mistake that after the Second World War, the United States gave up control of the territory, which he referred to as, quote, a big, beautiful piece of ice, end quote, that is, quote, actually part of North America, end quote. Quote, how stupid were we to do that, end quote. But his interest is less in the mineral reserves in Greenland than in America's national and international security. He said that Denmark had failed to invest in Greenland's security. Quote, every NATO ally has an obligation to be able to defend their own territory, and the fact is, no nation or group of nations is in any position to be able to secure Greenland other than the United States, end quote, Trump said. Quote, we're a great power, much greater than people even understand, end quote. A list of countries joining Trump's Board of Peace, those not joining, and those not committed, by the Associated Press. Several countries have said they will join U.S. President Donald Trump's Board of Peace, while a few European nations have declined their invitations. Many have not yet responded to Trump's invites. Chaired by Trump, the board was originally envisioned as a small group of world leaders overseeing the Gaza ceasefire plan, but the Trump administration's ambitions have since expanded, with Trump extending invitations to dozens of nations and hinting at the board's future role as conflict mediator. A White House official has said that about 30 countries were expected to join the board without providing details, while about 50 countries had been invited to join the organization. Here is a tally by the Associated Press on who is joining, who isn't, and who remains undecided. Countries that have accepted to join the board are Argentina, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Belarus, Egypt, Hungary, Kazakhstan, Kosovo, Morocco, Pakistan, United Arab Emirates, Vietnam. Countries that will not join the board, at least for now, France, Norway, and Sweden. And finally, countries that have been invited but remain non-committal. Britain, Canada, China, Croatia, Germany, Italy, European Union's executive arm, Paraguay, Russia, Singapore, Slovenia, Turkey, and Ukraine. Closing arguments set in former Uvalde officer's trial over actions during 2022 school attack by Valerie Gonzalez and Jim Vertuno. The trial of a former Uvalde, Texas school police officer accused of failing in his duty to stop a gunman in the critical first minutes of the 2022 Robb Elementary School attack was expected to go to the jury on Wednesday. Jurors will hear closing arguments from Adrian Gonzalez's attorneys and state prosecutors before starting deliberations in a rare trial of a police officer charged with failing to stop a criminal act to save lives. Gonzalez, one of the first officers to arrive during the attack, has pleaded not guilty to 29 counts of child abandonment or endangerment for the 19 students killed and 10 more who were wounded. 2 teachers were also killed by the teenage gunman. Gonzalez faces up to 2 years in jail if convicted. Gonzalez did not take the stand in his own defense before both sides rested their case Tuesday. Quote, "Every second counts in an active shooter situation," end quote, Special Prosecutor Bill Turner said Tuesday, drilling down on 3 minutes between when Gonzalez first arrived and when he went into the building. Quote, "Every second more victims can die if a police officer is standing and waiting," end quote. Prosecutors called 36 witnesses over 9 days in a trial that began January 5th. Gonzalez's attorneys presented just 2 witnesses, starting with a woman who worked across the street from the school and who told jurors she saw the shooter ducking between cars and trying to stay out of view, testimony that could reinforce Gonzalez's claims that he never saw the gunman. Jurors have heard emotional testimony from teachers who recounted the terrifying moments when the 18-year-old gunman entered the school. Prosecutors have presented graphic photos from inside the classrooms and questioned officers who described the chaos of the response. The trial was moved hundreds of miles to Corpus Christi after defense attorneys argued Gonzalez could not receive a fair trial in Uvalde. Still, some victims' families have made the long drive to watch the proceedings. Early in the trial, the sister of one of the teachers killed that day was removed from the courtroom after an angry outburst following one officer's testimony. Prosecutors allege the 52-year-old Gonzalez, a 10-year police veteran who had led an active shooter response training course 2 months before the shooting, abandoned his training and did not try to stop the gunman Salvador Ramos before he entered the school. Gonzalez, however, has insisted he didn't freeze in the chaotic early moments and never saw the gunman. His lawyers insist 3 officers on the other side of the school saw the gunman still outside and didn't fire a shot. Body camera footage shows Gonzalez being among the first group of officers to enter a shadowy and smoky hallway trying to reach the killer in a classroom. Teacher Arnulfo Reyes described seeing a, quote, "black shadow with a gun," end quote, enter the room before he was shot and all 11 of his students were killed. Other teachers describe students, some as young as 2nd grade, grabbing safety scissors to attack the gunman if he came into their room. Prosecutors stumbled at times while presenting their case, including inconsistent testimony from witnesses. A teacher who was one of the early witnesses was dismissed because prosecutors had not disclosed before trial that she recalled seeing the gunman dressed in black approaching the school. Defense lawyers asked for a mistrial on the 2nd day, but were denied after the state rested. They asked the judge to determine the state had not proved its case. That was also denied. Gonzalez was one of 376 federal, state, and local officers swarmed to the school as the attack unfolded. It would take more than an hour for a tactical team to breach a classroom and kill the gunman. Only Gonzalez and former Uvalde Schools Police Chief Pete Arredondo have been criminally charged for the delayed response. Arredondo was indicted on similar charges on the same day as Gonzalez in 2024, but his trial has not yet been set. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. EU chief says Trump's threats challenge Europe's security and prosperity ahead of emergency summit, by Lauren Cook. U.S. President Donald Trump's threats to annex Greenland and slap tariffs on its backers pose a challenge to Europe's security, principles, and prosperity, a top EU official said on Wednesday. Quote, all these three dimensions are being tested in the current moment of transatlantic relations, end quote, European Council President Antonio Costa said. He has convened an emergency summit of the EU's 27 national leaders in Brussels on Thursday. Trump's determination to, quote, acquire, end quote, the mineral-rich island in the Arctic region for what he claims are security reasons has undermined trust in the United States among allies in Europe and Canada. Denmark angered Trump after sending a military, quote, reconnaissance, end quote, force to Greenland, a semi-autonomous Danish territory. A small number of troops from several European nations joined, and Denmark is weighing a longer-term military presence there. Costa said EU leaders are united on, quote, the principles of international law, territorial integrity, and national sovereignty, end quote, something the bloc has underlined in defending Ukraine against invasion by Russia and which is now threatened in Greenland. In a speech to EU lawmakers in Strasbourg, France, he also stressed that only, quote, Denmark and Greenland can decide their future, end quote. He insisted that, quote, further tariffs would undermine transatlantic relations and are incompatible with the EU-US trade agreement, end quote. The lawmakers must endorse that deal made last July, but have threatened not to do so over Trump's tariffs threats. Costa said that, quote, we stand ready to defend ourselves, our member states, our citizens, our companies against any form of coercion, and the European Union has the power and the tools to do so, end quote. EU leaders have been galvanized by Trump's threats over Greenland and are rethinking their relations with America, their longtime ally and the most powerful member of NATO. Quote, appeasement is always a sign of weakness. Europe cannot afford to be weak, neither against its enemies nor ally, end quote, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, long a staunch supporter of strong transatlantic ties, posted on social media on Tuesday. Quote, appeasement means no results, only humiliation. European assertiveness and self-confidence have become the need of the moment, end quote, Tusk wrote. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who manages trade on behalf of EU countries, warned that the bloc is, quote, at a crossroads, end quote. Should tariffs come, she said, quote, we are fully prepared to act, if necessary, with unity, urgency, and determination, end quote. In Strasbourg, she told the lawmakers that the Commission is working on a massive European investment surge in Greenland, quote, end quote, to beef up its economy and infrastructure, as well as a new European security strategy. Security around the island itself should be boosted with partners like the UK, Canada, Norway, and Iceland, among others, von der Leyen said. Police begin to flex new powers in Guatemala in effort to confront gangs, by Sonia Perez D. Days after suspected gang members killed 10 Guatemalan police officers, police and soldiers took their new powers, granted under a state of emergency, to the Barrio 18 Gang's center of operations in the north of the capital. Dozens of police officers and soldiers, some carrying rifles and wearing bulletproof vests or with their faces covered, patrolled the narrow warren of streets in the cluster of neighborhoods called Zone 18 on Tuesday. At a checkpoint, they asked for identification of passing motorists and told some to stand against a wall to be patted down for weapons. There were 126 homicides in Zone 18 last year, and most of any of the capital's 24 districts. Police say it is a, quote, red zone, end quote, where the gang dominates. Early Tuesday, the bodies of 3 females, 1 pregnant and including 2 teens, were found shot in the street. Quote, this state of emergency is focused on head-on confrontation with the Barrio 18 and Mara Salvatrucha criminal structures, end quote, said Jorge Aguilar, National Civil Police spokesman. By Tuesday evening, dozens of police and soldiers lined up on a dusty soccer pitch where children kicked about a ball. Quote, we're in a high-risk moment. Don't get separated from the group. We have the soldiers accompanying us. We're going to work together. May God be with you, end quote, a police commander told officers before the patrol. Gangs have long oppressed neighborhoods in Guatemala, where they recruit children, extort businesses, and execute rivals. The problem came to a head over the weekend when gang members rioted in seemingly coordinated actions in 3 prisons on Saturday, taking dozens of guards hostage. On Sunday, police retook control of the prisons and freed the hostages, but almost immediately, police around the capital were attacked. So far, 10 police officers have died and several more remain hospitalized. President Bernardo Arevalo declared a 30-day state of emergency Sunday, and on Monday, the Congress overwhelmingly approved it. It restricts some rights of movement and assembly, as well as allowing police to detain people on suspicion of gang activity without a judge's arrest order. In Zone 18, several people asked about the gang presence declined to speak. Diana Gonzalez, who works as a cleaner, has lived in the area for 15 years. She conceded the area was dangerous, but, quote, it's where I have to live, end quote. She said that while she had not personally had problems with the gangs, the area carries a stigma. Quote, when I have looked for work, people don't hire me because I live in this zone, end quote, said Gonzalez, 34. Quote, they think that if you live here, you are a gangster. It marks all of us, end quote. Guatemala's homicide rate per 100,000 residents rose last year to 17.2 from 16.5 the previous year, according to data compiled by the non-governmental organization Dialogues. Arevalo has been under pressure to bring the violence under control. Last year, the Congress approved a new anti-gang law that designated Barrio 18 and Mara Salvatrucha as terrorist groups and increased prison sentences for gang members convicted of crimes. It followed the escape of 20 Barrio 18 members from a prison and the subsequent resignations of 3 top security officials. Last year, the United States government also designated both gangs as foreign terrorist organizations. The state of emergency is a tool President Nayib Bukele in neighboring El Salvador has used for nearly 4 years to decimate the gangs in his country. More than 90,000 people have been detained there on suspicion of gang ties, and Bukele's administration has faced international criticism for lack of due process and a violation of human rights. Arevalo has said that, quote, political criminal mafias, end quote, are trying to destabilize his administration. Germany arrests woman accused of supplying war-related information to Russian agent by the Associated Press. German authorities on Wednesday arrested a woman accused of supplying information related to Russia's war in Ukraine to a Russian intelligence agent and helping to get him access to political events in Berlin, prosecutors said. The German-Ukrainian dual citizen, identified only as Ilona W., in line with German privacy rules, was arrested in the German capital, federal prosecutors said. Her address was searched, as were those of 2 other suspects who weren't arrested. She is accused of acting for a foreign intelligence service. Prosecutors said in a statement that Ilona W. had been in contact since at least November 2023 with a man at the Russian embassy in Berlin who works for a Russian intelligence service. They alleged that on various occasions she applied him with information linked to the war in Ukraine. She allegedly helped with inquiries about defense industry locations, drone tests, and planned drone deliveries to Ukraine, and turned to former employees in, quote, the area of operations of the Defense Ministry, end quote, who were personal acquaintances. The woman also occasionally helped her Russian embassy contact visit political events in Berlin under aliases so that he could make contacts for Russian intelligence, prosecutors said. Defense Ministry spokesperson Mitko Müller said the investigation also involves 2 former German military employees, a recently retired officer and a civil servant who left over 15 years ago. Both are suspected of disclosing information to the woman who was arrested Wednesday, but investigators are looking into whether they knew it was destined for foreign intelligence. Rescuers spot wreckage possibly from a helicopter that went missing near a volcano in Japan, by the Associated Press. Rescuers spotted wreckage believed to be from a sightseeing helicopter carrying 3 people that went missing near one of Japan's most active volcanoes, authorities said Wednesday. The helicopter lost contact during what should have been a scenic 10-minute flight over Mount Aso in southern Japan on Monday, according to a flight operator and local authorities. Local police said wreckage, possibly of the missing helicopter, was spotted inside the crater of Nakadake, one of Mount Aso's 5 peaks, on Tuesday. However, strong winds and volcanic gases hampered the rescue operation, fire department officials said. Takumi Morioka, head of the helicopter tour operator Takumi Enterprise, said during a news conference Wednesday that the pilot and the 2 passengers were unaccounted for and that he hoped they survived. Last year, a helicopter operated by the same company made an emergency landing while flying over the same volcano, injuring 3 people on board, according to a press release published at that time. Volcano viewing helicopter tours around Mount Aso, which last erupted in October 2021, are among popular tourist attractions in the Kumamoto Prefecture in southwestern Japan. New Zealand election scheduled for November 7th, with the costs of living and housing the top issues, by Charlotte Graham McClay and Rod McGurk. New Zealand will hold a national election on November 7th, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon announced Wednesday. Luxon, the leader of a centre-right government, will seek a second term in office, with the election likely to be a ballot on whether his pledges to improve the economy after the COVID-19 pandemic have gained enough traction to convince voters still struggling with living and housing costs. The main center-left opposition Labour Party, led by Chris Hipkins, has regained support since its poor showing in the previous 2023 election, and analysts forecast a tight race. New Zealand elections are held every 3 years, with the government selecting the exact date. Voters choose which party they prefer to see in government and also select a local candidate to represent their constituency in Parliament. The country of 5 million people has a unicameral parliament, which means governments are powerful deciders of how the country operates. The National Party and Labour usually must form coalitions with smaller parties to hold a majority in Parliament, giving the minor parties unusual sway in which major party leads. Announcing the election date at a retreat for his party's lawmakers in the city of Christchurch on Wednesday, Luxon underlined what he said was his party's track record on working to rebuild a post-pandemic economy. Days earlier, in a speech to a business audience in Auckland on Monday, he acknowledged that reversing the country's fortunes had not been simple and that many New Zealanders have endured, quote, 2 years of hard grind, end quote. The economy has contracted a further 0.5 percentage points in the most recently measured 12 months, and migration to neighboring, wealthier Australia has at times hit record highs during Luxon's tenure. Luxon on Monday blamed the former Labor-led government for the country's woes, saying he had, quote, inherited a mess, end quote. Analysts said that with inflation trending down and business confidence beginning to grow, Luxon will hope the months until this year's election will be long enough to convince New Zealanders that the economic reversal he had pledged in 2023 is taking root. Hipkins, his main challenger to lead the country on Monday, dismissed Luxon's remarks as, quote, a whole lot of management speak mumbo-jumbo, end quote. The opposition leader added that Luxon hadn't delivered on political promises he had made, including making housing more affordable in what has been one of the world's hottest markets and ensuring access to public health care for all. Paying for the country's ailing infrastructure and how to fund pensions will also be central economic issues. Luxon decries Labor's approach as one reliant on accruing national debt, while Hipkins said Monday that National had squandered money on unaffordable tax cuts. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. New research bolsters evidence that Tylenol does not raise the risk of autism, despite Trump's claims, by Laura Ungar. A new review of studies has found that taking Tylenol during pregnancy does not increase the risk of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disabilities, adding to the growing body of research refuting claims made by the Trump administration. President Donald Trump last year promoted unproven ties between the painkiller and autism, telling pregnant women, quote, don't take Tylenol, end quote. The latest research review, published Friday in the Lancet Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Women's Health, looked at 43 studies and concluded that the most rigorous ones, such as those that compare siblings, provide strong evidence that taking the drug commonly known as paracetamol outside of the U.S. does not cause autism, ADHD, or intellectual disabilities. It's, quote, safe to use in pregnancy, end quote, said lead author Dr. Asma Khalil. Quote, it remains the first line of treatment that we would recommend if the pregnant woman has pain or fever, end quote. While some studies have raised the possibility of a link between autism risk and using Tylenol, also known as acetaminophen, during pregnancy, more haven't found a connection. A review published last year in BMJ said existing evidence doesn't clearly link the drug's use during pregnancy with autism or ADHD in offspring. A study published the previous year in the Journal of the American Medical Association also found it wasn't associated with children's risk of autism, ADHD, or intellectual disability in an analysis looking at siblings. But the White House is focused on research supporting a link. One of the papers cited on its webpage, published in BMC Environmental Health last year, analyzed results from 46 previous studies and found that they supported evidence of an association between Tylenol exposure during pregnancy and increased incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders. Researchers noted that the drug is still important for treating pain and fever during pregnancy, but said steps should be taken to limit its use. Some health experts have raised concerns about that review and the way Trump administration officials portrayed it, pointing out that only a fraction of the studies focus on autism and that an association doesn't prove cause and effect. Khalil, a fetal medicine specialist at St. George's Hospital, London, said that review included some studies that were small and some that were prone to bias. The senior author of that review was Dr. Andrea Baccarelli, Dean of the Faculty at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, who noted in the paper that he served as an expert witness for plaintiffs in a case involving potential links between acetaminophen use during pregnancy and neurodevelopmental disorders. Baccarelli did not respond to an email seeking comment on his study. Overall, Khalil said, research cited in the public debate showing small associations between acetaminophen and autism is vulnerable to confounding factors. For example, a pregnant woman might take Tylenol for fevers and fever during pregnancy may raise the risk for autism. Research can also be affected by, quote, recall bias, end quote, such as when the mother of an autistic child doesn't accurately remember how much of the drug she used during pregnancy after the fact, Khalil said. When researchers prioritize the most rigorous study approaches, such as comparing siblings to account for the influence of things like genetics, quote, the association is not seen, end quote, she said. Genetics are the biggest risk factor for autism, experts say. Other risks include the age of the child's father, preterm birth, and whether the mother had health problems during pregnancy. In a commentary published with the latest review, a group of researchers who weren't involved from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Children's Hospital Colorado, and elsewhere, cautioned that discouraging the use of acetaminophen during pregnancy could lead to inadequate pain or fever control, and that may hurt the baby as well as the mother. Untreated fever and infection in a pregnant woman poses, quote, well-established risks to fetal survival and neurodevelopment, end quote, they said. As the planet warms, how can the Winter Olympics and Paralympics adapt? By Jordan Olmsted. New research out of Canada is pitching ideas for how to make the Winter Olympics and Paralympics more resilient to climate change. It builds on recent research co-authored by the University of Waterloo's Daniel Scott that suggested only 16 of a possible 93 locations can reliably host the Paralympics in March by 2080 if global warming continues on its current trajectory. The Olympics fare better with about half of those locations keeping up enough snow depth and cold temperatures to reliably host in February. The new research published today says unifying the games in February is one strategy, but the mega event would raise more logistical issues and possibly cut out smaller cities. Another idea Scott and his co-authors say is promising would be shifting both games earlier by 2 to 3 weeks. The study suggests that nearly doubles the number of reliable Paralympic locations by 2080, with only a small cut to the list of potential Olympic hosts. The research also suggests snowmaking, despite its water and energy demands, will be critical to the future of the Games. Without it, the study suggests only 7 places could reliably host the events right now, down to 4 or fewer by mid-century. The study says those who oppose snowmaking at the Winter Games would, quote, condemn, end quote, the events to increasingly unfair and unsafe conditions for athletes until snow sports are excluded entirely. Snowmaking has been used at each Winter Games since Lake Placid in 1980, but Beijing was the first to rely on it almost entirely in 2022. At next month's Milan's Cortina Games, organizers plan to make about 2.4 million cubic meters of snow. When Cortina hosted in 1956, no manufactured snow was used, though some was trucked in by the Italian army from the Dolomites. Finding ways to make snowmaking more sustainable must be a priority for the Games, the study said. In a statement, co-author Madeleine Orr said, quote, no sport can escape the impacts of climate change, end quote. Quote, the world's best athletes who have dedicated their lives to sport deserve nothing less than the best conditions that can be provided sustainably. The winter sport community must work together to find solutions to adapt to climate change and achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, end quote, said Orr, a sport ecology professor at the University of Toronto. The study was published in the peer-reviewed journal Current Issues in Tourism and co-authored with Robert Steiger at Austria's University of Innsbruck. Previous research co-authored by Steiger and Scott showed that of the 21 hosts to date, almost half would not be, quote, climatically reliable, end quote, by mid-century. A location was unreliable if it didn't have sufficient snow depth or cold temperatures in 75% of its winters. That research got the attention of the International Olympic Committee. Scott says shortly after they presented their findings, the IOC paused the bidding race for the 2030 Games and cited the need to further study the effects of climate change. Scott and Steiger were commissioned by the IOC to expand their original analysis to 93 locations, including mountain ranges with ski runs approved for international competition. The highest elevation ski resorts in each of those ranges were assessed in the 2024 study. The Games now require snow competition venues to be climate reliable until at least mid-century. Centuries of Love Letters go on display at the National Archives in London by Jill Lawless. Love is, famously, a many-splendored thing. It can encompass longing, loneliness, pain, jealousy, grief, and sometimes joy. As Valentine's Day approaches, the many facets of passion are going on display in an exhibition called Love Letters at Britain's National Archives that covers 5 centuries. Curator Victoria Iglikowski-Broad said that the documents recount, quote, legendary romances from British history, end quote, involving royalty, politicians, celebrities, and spies, quote, alongside voices of everyday people. We're trying to open up the potential of what a love letter can be, end quote, she told the Associated Press on Wednesday. Quote, expressions of love can be found in all sorts of places and surprising places, end quote. They also take many forms. The exhibition ranges from early 20th century classified ads seeking the same-sex romance to sweethearts' letters to soldiers at war and a medieval song about heartbreak. There is also, quote, one of our most iconic documents, end quote, Iglikowski-Broad said, referring to a poignant letter to Queen Elizabeth I from her suitor, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Written days before Dudley's death in 1588, it conveys the intimacy between the, quote, virgin queen, end quote, who never married, and the man who called himself your poor old servant. The missive with, quote, his last letter, end quote, written on the outside, spelling at the time was idiosyncratic, was found at the Queen's bedside when she died almost 15 years later. Love in the exhibition doesn't just mean romance. Family bonds are in evidence in Jane Austen's handwritten will from 1817, leaving almost everything to her beloved sister Cassandra, and in a 1956 letter in which the father of London gangster twins Reggie and Ronnie Cray implores a court to go easy on the brothers because, quote, all their concern in life is to do good to everybody, end quote. The letter writers range from paupers to princes. In an 1851 petition, an unemployed 71-year-old weaver named Daniel Rush begs authorities not to separate him and his wife by sending them to workhouses. It's displayed along the instrument of abdication through which King Edward VIII gave up the throne in 1936 so that he could marry, quote, the woman I love, end quote, twice divorced American Wallis Simpson. Quote, there is a lot of connection in these two items, even though on the surface they seem very different. Iglikowski-Broad said, in common they have just this human feeling of love, that the sacrifice is actually worth it for love, end quote. Other documents tell of love lost. There is a never-before-displayed 1944 letter from young British intelligence officer John Cairncross to his former girlfriend Gloria Barraclough, reflecting on what might have been. Quote, would we have broken off, I wondered, if we had known what was coming, end quote. Some readers may think Barraclough had a lucky escape. Years later, Cairncross was unmasked as a Soviet spy. Some love stories tell of danger, heartbreak, and tragedy. In one, Lord Alfred Douglas asks, in vain, for Queen Victoria to pardon his lover, Oscar Wilde. The writer had been sentenced to 2 years in prison for gross indecency after Douglas's outraged father revealed their relationship. Nearby is a letter written in 1541 by Catherine Howard, fifth wife of King Henry VIII, to her secret beau, Thomas Culpeper. Archives historian Neil Johnston noted that the tone of the extraordinary letter is, quote, restrained panic. She is warning him to be very, very careful, end quote. Catherine signed off the letter, quote, yours as long as life endures, end quote. That turned out not to be long. The king discovered the affair, and both Catherine and Culpeper were executed for treason. A letter by Queen Henrietta Maria to King Charles I, my dear heart, end quote, is a real rarity, since Britain's royal family guards its private papers closely. It was found among possessions left behind by the fleeing king in 1645 after a battlefield defeat for royalist troops in England's Civil War. Charles lost the war and was tried, convicted, and executed in 1649. The letter ended up in Parliament's archives, which last year was transferred to the National Archives. Quote, we don't have very many intimate letters between monarchs like this, end quote, Johnston said. Quote, this is a little gem within the disaster of the English Civil War, end quote. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the 21st of January issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Rachel Durkin Durga. Thank you for listening.